Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on International Women's Day. Ambassador Vassi, thank you for hosting tonight's event and inviting me to be a part of it. My name is Dr. Vanessa Newby. I'm an assistant professor at Leiden University and the president of the Netherlands chapter of Women in International Security. My research is increasingly focused on gender and security, in particular the Women, Peace and Security agenda, women in peacekeeping, and women in security institutions. Tonight's event is entitled Women and Strategic Affairs, a Singular Voice. I don't think we can really discuss the field of international security and defense without mentioning Resolution 1325, which has contributed to a global recognition of the disproportionate effects that war and conflict have on women and the need for women's inclusion in peace and security measures. Since 2000, the WPS agenda has expanded to include 10 resolutions, and the idea that women may have a different perspective on peace and security is increasingly gaining recognition. At the national level, several states have announced they are adopting feminist foreign policy approaches to incorporate feminist thinking on international peace and security. Thus far, Sweden, Canada, France, and Mexico have announced they are interested in adopting feminist approaches in their foreign policy. What this means for defense and international security is perhaps less clear. And so tonight we will hear from distinguished scholars speaking and practitioners speaking about their views on the inclusion of women in international security and drawing on their professional experiences. So what we have tonight is really a showcase of the multiple experiences of women working in the field of security, some as practitioners and some as researchers. In discussions on the WPS agenda, it's been noted that women should never be treated as a homogeneous group with the same needs and interests. I think the melange of perspectives here tonight will give you a good sense of the many roles women currently play in international peace and security. Now, we have several speakers tonight, and I'd like to introduce them all now in advance. So I'd like to first introduce Mr. Louis Vassi, Ambassador of France to the Netherlands. He will provide an introduction to this event. In 2019, President Macron named Louis Vassi Ambassador to the Kingdom of the Netherlands and permanent representative to the OPCW. Louis Vassi began his diplomatic career in 2004 at the headquarters of the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs. He has held positions at the French Embassy in Washington, D.C., at the Private Office of the Defense Ministry, the Private Office to the Veterans Affairs Minister, and from 2014 to 2017, he was diplomatic advisor to the Defense Minister. In May 2017, he was appointed Deputy Chief of Staff to the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs when Jean-Yves Le Drian was named Foreign Minister. Louis Vassi is an international gender champion. Now, I'm moving on to our speakers. As I've said, I'll just provide their bios first and then we'll get started. Our first speaker tonight, after the ambassador, is Ms. Nathalie Loiseau. Nathalie Loiseau is a member of the European Parliament, the Renew Europe group. She is chair of the Subcommittee on Security and Defence at the European Parliament. She is a former French Minister of European Affairs from 2017 to 2019. She was the director of the École Nationale d'Administration from 2012 to 2017. She began her diplomatic career in 1986. She studied at the Paris Institute of Political Studies and at the National Institute of Oriental Languages and Civilizations. Our second speaker tonight is Professor Beatrice de Graaf. Beatrice de Graaf is a Dutch professor of international and political history at Utrecht University. She studied history and German at Utrecht and the University of Bonn. Furthermore, she is a member of De Jong Academy of the Royal Dutch Academy of Sciences. She's a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations and various advisory committees in the field of national and international security. As a terrorism expert, she regularly comments on current affairs in the media. Our third speaker is Ms. Muriel Domenach. Muriel Domenach is the Ambassador Permanent Representative of France to NATO in Brussels since September 2019. She was previously Secretary General of the Interagency Committee for the Prevention of Crime and Radicalization for 3 years, from 2016 to 2019. She began her diplomatic career as a Special Assistant for European Security and Defence Policy at the delegation of the Strategic Affairs of the Ministry of Defense. She studied at the Paris Institute of Political Sciences, Sciences Po, and was an exchange student at Brown University in the US. She also studied at the College of Europe in Bruges and at the French National School of Administration. And our fourth speaker tonight is Ms. Marise Gerard. Marise Gerard is the Ambassador, Permanent Representative of the Netherlands to NATO in Brussels since 2018. She was previously Ambassador to South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Lesotho, and Eswatini for 4 years. She has a master's degree in European Studies from the University of Amsterdam. Now, just before we start, I'd like to remind all our speakers that we have around 10 minutes for each person to speak, and I will do my best to keep this event to time. So if we start to run over, I will put up my hand. Actually, I choose to challenge the International Women's Day symbol today to remind the speaker that they're coming close to being out of time. I would also like to remind all visitors that if they would like to ask a question, there is a Q&A function available in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. So please put your questions in there, and we will, towards the end of the evening, be moderating those questions for discussion. I'd also like to remind you all to keep if you're not speaking, to keep your camera closed and your speakers closed. I would now like to start our discussion with some introductory remarks from Ambassador Mr. Louis Vassy.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I would like to say that I'm really extremely glad that we were able to gather such a high-level panel tonight for what I expect to be an incredibly insightful discussion. I will refrain on this particular occasion to exert any kind of mansplaining, so I want to be extremely short and maybe just give a couple of elements on my perspective on the issue. When we thought about what we could do on March 8th that would be useful, we had the possibility, of course, to do the usual video explaining how great we are at the embassy in terms of parity, but I think we did that already last year. So I thought it would be maybe more useful for the general public if we enter in a substantive issue. Since I'm a diplomat, as many participants tonight, I thought it could be useful to look into one of the fields that is certainly still suffers from gender bias and against which I think we can do useful work. And so it came as a natural thing, I would say, to try and dig into this issue of women in international security, defense, and diplomacy. As far as I'm concerned, I've tried to push this agenda forward in my career. I guess that diversity issues in general are important to me as a diplomat, a French person coming from an immigrant background. Diversity is something that I certainly cherish and try to promote. And of course, gender diversity is certainly the cornerstone of all other policies we can develop. So there are three things I think we can do as policymakers, and that's what I've tried to do in the past. First one is, of course, have safe spaces for women and for everyone, but certainly there are issues that are gender biased, and I'm really proud that I was able to work with Minister Le Drian in setting together an anti-sexual harassment, strong anti-sexual harassment policy at the Foreign Ministry. Second, of course, is simply equality in terms of promotion all along the career. There is certainly a long way to go. I think we are not far now from 30% women ambassador at the French Foreign Ministry. It's still not enough by all means, but it's still 3 times more than 10 years ago, and I hope that we can accelerate the pace of this equalization and this equal playing field. And third, and I think that's why this group is really outstanding for that, and to promote equality, we certainly need role models. And I'm really happy to have Muriel and Nathalie that I have known for so many years, and that play a key role in making sure that women understand that they are at their rightful place wherever they want to be. Of course, Beatrice de Graaf, with whom I have worked a lot these last few months on anti-radicalization issues, particularly. And I want, of course, to say a warm welcome and hello to my Dutch colleague in Brussels, Marissa, whom I don't know yet, but I'm sure when she comes to The Hague at some point, we can get together and in real life, as people say. And with that, I'd like to say that any good crisis, like the Corona crisis, is an opportunity. So we would not necessarily have been able to gather such a high-level panel at the residence in the Hague. The miracle of online events is that we can get together for this occasion, and I'm really glad that we took the initiative to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It's always heartwarming to know when someone's been working on these issues over a period of time. So I'm now going to invite our next speaker, our first speaker, Ms. Nathalie Loiseau, to come and take the floor. Ms. Loiseau?
Yes.
Hello.
You can see me. That's wonderful. Well, first of all, thank you for having me tonight. It's a pleasure to be with you, Vanessa, such an expert on women and peace and security. And thank you to Ambassador Vassy for his invitation to take part in this conversation. I would like to start where you started yourself, Vanessa, with the UN Security Council 1325 resolution. 20 years ago, finally, people found out that maybe it was a good idea to realize that half of the world's population was made of women. And then in conflicts, most of the conflicts have an impact on the situation of women worldwide. 20 years ago, we should expect that in 20 years, huge progress was being made. It's not exactly the case yet, although we should focus much more on working for women and with women, if I may say so. In the European Union, the European Council adopted a strategic approach to women in peace and security in 2018. And then in 2019, a plan of action to try to pay more attention to women in peace and security. Last year, the European Parliament adopted a report on women in peace and security, which was drafted in my subcommittee, where this topic is getting higher and higher on the agenda. What I wanted to share is my experience both as a French diplomat for 26 years and now in the European Parliament. There is no conflict which has no impact on women. Women as targets to begin with. And it's only too easy to find examples in Congo with sexual violence against women, which is well documented. In Afghanistan, a few days ago, 3 women were killed because they were beginning to be role models for others. And this is precisely what armed groups wanted to avoid and go against this presence and empowerment of women in the Afghan society. And we remember that for years, the attempts to trigger a peace process in Afghanistan were men-only driven. The Loya Jirga, which was put as an example of how you deal with including civil society in a peace process, was purely male-dominated. So far, women have not found their place in the political settlement in Afghanistan. I would like to stop for a little longer on Syria, just to get attention to our own biases when we talk about women in armed conflicts. Of course, in Syria, for 10 years, women have been targeted. Among detainees, we know that there has been more than 100,000 detainees in Assad's prisons. A number are women, and they suffered sexual violences, which means that they suffer twice, not only when they are in prison, but after they leave prison, because their family live with this notion that there is shame on the family. So some are killed after being freed, or some have to flee Syria because they want people to forget about what they suffered. But we also have women with arms. Let us just think about Kurdish fighters fighting against Daesh in the Syrian Kurdistan. A number of them are women. And for quite a long time, and I'm sure Muriel Domenac will be able to talk about it even better than I do, we had a bias vis-a-vis women jihadists, European jihadists going to Syria. We were targeting men jihadists, trying to get them, arrest them, and prosecute them and bring them to trial. And we were considering that women were only following their beloved ones and were victims, whereas a number of them played a terrible role in pushing for propaganda about jihad or supporting men in their jihadist activities. Now, things are a little clearer in the minds of people in the European Union, that if women come back to Europe, they have to be prosecuted exactly as men have to be. Among our biases, I would like also to stress that sometimes we consider that women in power have necessarily a positive role. And it brings us to the very difficult question of Aung San Suu Kyi. And it is especially difficult to talk about her now that she's in prison and now that bloody repression has restarted in Myanmar. But let us not forget that when the Rohingya crisis started and persecution against people, which may amount to acts of genocide, was documented, Aung San Suu Kyi not only remained silent, but she even defended the actions of the Burmese military in international fora. So it's just to make us realize that our biases can always play a role in the way we see women in armed conflicts. And then I would like to narrow the focus and go back to a very personal experience I had when I was in the French diplomatic service in the 1990s. I was posted in Senegal, where a low intensity, or at least a low intention conflict was taking place in Casamance, in the south of Senegal, where armed groups had all interest to remain in a conflict and very little interest in getting back to peace. You had the Senegalese military making fortunes of controlling part of the territory and part of the traffics. And you had militiamen, rebels living in the forests. And it was a risky life, but they were also having sort of a good time. And I can testify because I was a mediator at the time. I went several times to Casamance to talk to the military, but also I went to rebel areas to try to bring men back home. And I worked with families. I worked with women, their wives, their mothers, their daughters, to give them a sense that they were not living a normal life, that they were having the easy part of life, where their wives and daughters and mothers were suffering from landmines or suffering from being alone to work for the whole family. It took some time. It took to be a woman to go and see these people. So to be obviously different. I mean, a white European woman. And at the time I was pregnant all the time. I had 3 babies when I was in Senegal. So I was either pregnant or with a baby when I was going to Casamance. And it was bringing back to these rebels the notion of normal life and that maybe they should come back. And we worked on DDR at the time. It's very easy when you're a man working on these topics to focus on disarmament and demobilization. But you have to bear in mind reconstruction from day one. And you have to have projects. You have to have development assistance in order for rebels to be able to earn their living as soon as they get out of the forest where they had taken refuge. And this is what we did. I was bringing messages from the wives and from the daughters. And I was working with NGOs going against landmines. And I was trying to push for development projects, hiring former rebels and just turning a blind eye on what they had done before. Now I'm working a lot on Syria and working on transitional justice because we have to think about what will take place one day in Syria. There should be a justice, otherwise there will not be peace. Working for women, we have to work with women, and that's easy. I mean, tonight's panel shows it. My daily life as a chair of the Security and Defense Committee shows it as well. There are plenty of women who are relevant to talk about security. When I want to talk about disarmament, I ask to Mrs. Nakamitsu from the UN to come and talk. When I want to talk about NATO, I ask to Alexandra de Hopskefer. When I want to talk about strategic autonomy, Florence Gaub is probably one of the most relevant speakers. There is the very simple principle of no women, no panel. And if we can make it there in security and defense, we can make it everywhere.
What a fantastic speech. And it pained me to have to hold my hand up to time, Nathalie, because there's so much in what you said that is just so important. And I particularly love your grassroots experience of actually just being in the field and going down to those conflicts and seeing how they play out on the ground. I mean, that's just exceptionally useful learning experience, but also for those of us listening to it. And I really appreciated the way you distilled your views on gender. I mentioned this before, but this not seeing women as some monolithic entity and homogenous, and that we all, you know, in the literature, we have this thing of, you know, women. There's a very famous book about women being beautiful souls and men being noble warriors, and that dichotomy between the two. And as you rightly say, this is just not the case. Women can be aggressors as much as men, depending on the situation. And it just shows how much of all this is not gender essentialist because of our biological, it's because of the gender roles and the context in which people are operating. So thank you so much. And there's so much more I'd love to ask you, but I hope in the questions we can unpack some of that. Because I found that incredibly useful. But unfortunately, fortunately, but also reluctantly, I have to let you go. And but with great pleasure, I would now like to pass the floor to our next speaker, Professor Beatrice de Graaf, if she would like to come forward.
Yes, please. You need to uncover my video.
Oh, can the technical people do that? Because I'm not sure I'm allowed to, or able to, rather.
Well, thank you so very much, Vanessa, for this invitation. Also, thank you, Nathalie, for your beautiful and inspiring talk, for Ambassador Fassi to invite us all here tonight. Unfortunately, not in person, but at least online. And I'm very happy to participate in this highly important panel. And I would like to address 2 points tonight, a point on IR, women in IR, and a point on terrorism, women in terrorism. I'm not going to share with you a lengthy essay on why it's such a pity that the average share of female professors in the Netherlands only varies between 20% and 30%. We are ranking, only Belgium goes behind us, but we're ranking the lowest in the EU. I'm neither complaining about online harassment and targeting of female professors, scholars, and politicians. It's at the center of the Dutch public debate right now. These are two important statements to make, but we can discuss this later in the discussion. But I really want to make this constructive point about women in IR and women in terrorism now. I am a researcher myself. I work in both fields, both in the present day, doing oral history interviews, giving policy advice, but I'm also looking back in history. And the interesting thing is with women in international security is that it's only very recently being seen as a problem that there are so little women in the field. There is a high increase over the past years, perhaps a decade or so, but it is still a novel development. And that's a problem because of the lack of women in the field, as researchers, as professionals, as ministers, we also have a flawed and a limited view on the role of women. Natalie already touched upon that. And why does that matter? Well, if you look back in IR, and if you look back on how the history of international relations, of European integration, of the balance of power, how that is written, that's written on the basis of just a book that came out, and it's called Men on Horseback. It's about Napoleon, it's about Wellington, it's about the great presidents, the leaders, the generals. But if you look more closely, you'll find that not just behind those men, but also next to these men were very many important women, but they have been left out of history. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because they were also the creators of the world we live in today. And there's a book that just came out. I want to stress that book, flesh out that book. It's called Women's International Political Thought by Patricia Owens. And she makes the point that we need to go back to the records, not just the formal records of the foreign offices, of the State Departments, of NATO, the European Commission, but also go back and look at the letters that were written to the male ministers. For example, Jean Monnet, one of the founding fathers of the European integration process, was heavily assisted, or perhaps not assisted, but he worked with his sister, who was a great friend of the then Pope. And this sister was the president of the female network of Catholic women in France. And she had a vast network throughout Europe. And without, well, it's of course iffy history, but without working together with his sister, Jean Monnet would probably not have made the inroads that he had in the field of Catholic support. Just to flesh out an example of this. So in IR, it's important not just to stress the fact that we need women out there now working in the field like Natalie does, but we also need to look back in history how women have shaped the world we live in today. And there's far too little attention to that. And that brings me to my second point, women in terrorism. Here again, the fact that there's so many, well, it's changing now, but before that there were so little women working in the field of terrorism studies. That meant that there was, again, a flawed and a limited understanding of the role of women in the field. If books came out on female terrorism, for example, in the 80s, it was a famous book by a female journalist, nevertheless, Aline MacDonald, and it was called Shoot the Women First. So there was either an over-exaggeration of the dangerousness, the danger of women as terrorists, because if a female person became a terrorist, she must have been a real monster. Otherwise, why would you forsake her motherly, her soft duties? So either the women were monsters, like Ulrike Meinhof, the female leader and one of the founders of the Red Army faction in Germany, was seen as a Rabenmutter, someone who abandoned her children, which she did not. They were taken away from her by her husband. And she did not become a terrorist only after she was put up on all the billboards and sought as a terrorist. She did not participate in an attack only after she was prosecuted for that. There's strange and a complex story there to tell. But my point is here that it was exaggerated how dangerous she was. And why is that a tragedy and also a mistake? Because it robs you of very important operational facilities and capacities that you can have in drawing people back into the normal fold of society, most possibly. It sort of depraves you of the operational possibilities, the creativity that there is in finding a way to de-radicalize people. The other aspect of female persons in terrorism is that they are underestimated. And that's the other danger, the flawed and the limited approach to women in terrorism. It's that they underestimate it. It's thought, for example, today that within the global jihad, the role of women is only to support their male warriors, to do some recruiting, to do some dissemination of propaganda. But it came as a surprise to many of the services in Western Europe and in the United States that so many females, young female teenagers went to Iraq and Syria, not just to support, but also be a central part of the fight itself, perhaps not in battle gear, but they were there at the front lines. Another aspect of this underestimation of female terrorists also took place. I'm very fascinated about this case study in France. And since we're here in the French embassy, I may be allowed to raise this example as well. Action Directe was a very effervescent, a very ambivalent terrorist organization. It was not as notorious as the Red Army faction or the Red Brigades, but it was there. And they assassinated and they killed French officials. For example, René Audran in 1985, an official in the Department of Defense. He was killed by two women, or at least two women were involved in the killing plot, Nathalie Ménigon and Yobel Aubron. And they were given amnesty by President Mitterrand before, and then afterwards people underestimated their level of radicalization, and they were left free in order to, that's why they could carry out again their lethal killings. There's much more to be said about that, but I think this is very important. The same happened in the Netherlands with the women behind the Hofstad group, and also in Germany with right-wing extremist terrorism. You may recall the National Socialist Untergrund organization, the neo-Nazi or white extremist and terrorist network, the NSU, that killed more than 10 people a couple of years back. And they pivoted around the role of Beate Zschäpe. And Beate Zschäpe lived out in the open. She had a house and she was the one most probably organizing all the logistics, probably not acting out the killing itself, but she made sure that her two compatriots, her two perpetrators, were supported. And everyone thought that she was just a nice little lady, a neighbor lady. She was completely underestimated. And this is where I conclude. I think it's a great asset to the field of research that there are far more female researchers, but it's even more important that in the research itself, it's not enough that you are a female or a man doing the research. You need to go back to the records, to the sources, and be far more creative and be far more open-minded and reassess the role of women, the role of the various roles. I have to stress the fact that it's a multiplicity of roles, the roles of women, the full spectrum of roles that they can take on, and that they themselves also play with the fact that they may seem cute or they may seem harmless or they may be exaggerated. So they also, male the same like female, they play with their frames, with the media framing, the Twitter framing. And a last thread that's out there right now, and it's just emerged. And I know that one of my colleagues in the terrorism field, Mia Bloom, who wrote terrific books on terrorism, she's preparing a new book on something that is called Pastel QAnon. And it's about the fact that so many mothers, women engaging in yoga, nice cozy church ladies perhaps, or childbirth trainers, people engaged in Save the Children activities, that are now embracing QAnon, but they're also the ones in this very cozy, motherhood-like, warm social media activities. They are sharing, disseminating, recruiting, spreading the destructive ideology of QAnon, and where anti-vaccine calls are the least of our worries. So I think the fact that women are agents, that women are contributing as leaders, as thought leaders, not just as supporters, but also as intellectual leaders, is something that we should acknowledge more, and work harder to flesh out. And it requires from us as researchers a new way of looking back at the sources, looking at the police records, but also looking at things that we see in the media nowadays. So it's a good sign that we're here as women, but it's also high time that we need to start taking women in security as targets, as perpetrators, as victims serious. Thank you so much.
That's where I wish there was a little applause mechanism. These speeches are amazing. Thank you so much. What a rich and full and to time speech. Thank you. I love, what you're saying about the invisibility of women and how they've shaped history and the world, and the lack of visibility in formal documents. I think that's really important. I would also say, as a fellow researcher, that sometimes it can be difficult to find the willingness for people to sponsor these oral histories, and to, even what's going on today, to try and get the non-official side of the story, which is often where women function. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. Also, I love what you were talking about, I mean, the classic is Laura Schoberg, right? Mothers, monsters, whores. This idea that, when women do commit violence, somehow it's doubly worse. We see that in the prison system, actually. Women tend to get harsher sentences, right, for crime. So thank you for again, kind of building on Natalie's comments as well about the diversity of women and the agency of women. And of course, as an IR scholar, I can totally relate to this lack of female perspective in IR, where we're all taught as junior scholars that, we have to listen to the big white men who came up with the theories, and feminism, so a space I play in, still very much regarded as, well, what's that got to do with IR? It's changing, but for a long time, as you know, was not really seen as a mainstream theory. So thank you so much. And hopefully people will have questions for you as well. I will now pass the floor to our next speaker, Ms. Muriel Domenach.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hello and welcome. Hi. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. And thanks to Louise for convening us today. Thanks, Vanessa, for introducing everyone, and happy to interact with Beatrice, whom I heard of and read articles of during my previous job as the head of the prevention of radicalization. And hi, Marisa. Long time no see. Happy to be interacting with my Dutch colleague, Marisa. Echoing you ladies and echoing Louise as well, a few points that I would like to stress, and I'll try and not be too long. Yes, there's a lack of women perspectives in security. Marisa and I are, to take NATO, for example, and the North Atlantic Council, Marisa and I are 6 of the 30 ambassadors at the North Atlantic Council, still a long way to go. So while women and security has come up on the NATO agenda, which is good, still a long way to go, both from nations and also from the organization, for women to take higher positions and actually impact on the agenda. Obviously, security is seen as and jobs in security are seen as tough jobs. Natalie touched the peace processes and how one would feel one has to protect women and not, exposing women to difficult situations. Then there's our own self-censorship as women that would, keep us away from asserting ourselves. And we would rather, if there's if we have, you know, 80% of the required skills to apply for a job, we would rather look at the 20% that we feel not comfortable with. So there's self-censorship, there's glass ceilings. I'm not coming back to this. Probably we tend to see ourselves as you know, bossy when in positions of command. Our minister for, our deputy minister for the interior, Marlène Schiappa, headed a roundtable this morning called commandante. So that's the feminine for commander, which originally in French was seen as a negative. You know, ne fais pas ta commandante was would be the equivalent for don't act like you're bossy. So that would go with a sort of a self-censorship. Security is also home to many boys' clubs. Originally, you know, security is also for those reasons, but because, you know, a boys' club is what happens when, you know, our men colleagues are not told, you know, hey, we're here, we can add value. So boys' club are not anti-women. They just happen to, you know, develop by themselves unless they're told differently. So a lot of that has led to the situation where women are still underrepresented. And I think, I mean, my take is a lot of you ladies is, of course, that women add value and we should have more women in security, not only because it's right, but because it's smart. There's the lack, I mean, lacking women perspectives is and has been an issue in a number of security affairs. My experience, and I want to echo Nathalie and Beatrice on that, is that on radicalization, for example, lacking women in anti-terrorism positions probably had us to diminish, underestimate the phenomena related to, you know, women and radicalization. In our case, as France, 30% of the women that went on theater to Syria, so 30% are women. Of those 30%, more than half are converts. That's an interesting figure. And of those 50%, our assessment is that a high number has gone through family abuse, sexual abuse. So that is to state the gender factor in radicalization. And because women are part of the issues and the problems, they have to be part of the solution. They have to be part of the decision-making process. Otherwise, there's a lack of perspectives. They also have to be factored in de-radicalization policies, including, you know, while once in prison, it takes specific health care, mental health care for the reasons I mentioned. I would also insist on another issue that my Dutch colleague and I have been discussing a number of times, and I know our ambassador in The Hague is also following this closely. It's the disinformation where it so happens, and our representative for gender equality here at NATO is quite knowledgeable on this, Claire Hutchison. I would suggest that one day we interact with her. The involvement of women in disinformation. Quite interestingly, women, because again, they're half of the population, they're half of the audience, so surprisingly and interestingly, in disinformation actors would target women as part of their audience, and they would use women for that. So the notion that women are part of disinformation, not only disinformation connected with the far right, if I take our situation as France, this huge polarization and over-representation of both extremes, to say things in schematic terms, I would say the far right, and then we also have a far left and also some of the Islamist sphere are very much connected to women actors and issues. So again, because women are part of the issues, they should be part of the perspective, they should be part of the solutions. And I would end with a strong plea for gender equality, not as in the sense of women replacing and kicking men out of the scene, but rather adding to our men colleagues. And we have this movement in France called Jamais sans elles, never without them, that barely translates into English, but that would be my concluding word, Jamais sans elles. Also insecurity.
Thank you so much. There was so much in what you said that linked in with what's already been said, but in a really nice kind of bringing it together way. I really responded to what you were saying about, women in institutions, the ability to even get jobs in security institutions. It's often limited by women's own self-censorship. But also we see as well that often there's a claim, we want women in mediation, for example, but they're not qualified. And there isn't sort of an understanding that women, there haven't been enough women being promoted. So sometimes maybe you need to look at other characteristics and appoint these women without the sort of formal tracks. So I think what you really highlighted for me was for women in security institutions, you can have all the rules in place, but it's how you function within those roles, right? Within those rules in themselves. And as you say, if certain characteristics are regarded negatively, we know from research that if women are assertive, it's taken a very different way when men are assertive. So all these kind of micro behaviors and micro issues can add up to inequality. So I felt like you sort of raised those issues, which is sort of helps kind of almost round out what we're talking about, all the different aspects of the barriers and also the opportunities for women. I also responded a lot to what you were saying about women, and again, as Professor de Graaf said, the sort of vulnerable position of women who get the double punishment for having been part of a movement or terrorism as well, which I think is, and the fact that, as you say, women are part of the problem, so they need to be considered part of the solution. So thank you very much for those insights. They're incredibly valuable. And I will now, last but very much not least, like to pass the floor to our final speaker, Ms. Marisa Gerard. If our technical people can.
Yes.
I hear you. I don't see you yet, but I'm sure you'll pop up in
I'm in here.
Second.
Can you see me? Am I there?
Yes, now we see you. Yes, thank you so much. Would you like to speak, or would you like me to ask you questions? How would you like to progress?
Well, I can say a few words, and if you want to come in, ask me a few questions, that will be fine too. Let me just start by thanking you, Vanessa and Wise as well. I think it's a great organization, also very active here in NATO. So good to meet you. And also I would like to thank Ambassador Vasi for this webinar. I think it's very interesting on this very day to meet each other, and we're going to meet each other very soon because Muriel and I are planning to visit The Hague. Also good to see Beatrice again. Last time when we met was at my husband's birthday, actually in The Hague. I don't know if she remembers. And of course, Natalie, very good to meet you. And maybe Vanessa, if I can say a few words, and maybe if you want to come in with a question, please do. I was really triggered by Natalie, the things that she was telling us about Africa, about the world, about the work she did in Syria as well. it's not a pretty picture that she was painting. And we know that for many women, it's really tough out there, especially in conflict and post-conflict situations. And I was ambassador in South Africa for 4 years, and maybe it is still a post-conflict country. That could very well be, but it's a very male-dominated country, very violent. And also, I think sisterhood is a kind of a lifeline for many women in that situation. And on the one hand, I think during the struggle years, they were fighting shoulder to shoulder with the men for the post-apartheid South Africa. But once that the struggle was over, I think the men were again dividing the positions of power. And for them, it was really a struggle. And for me as an ambassador, it was really great because as an ambassador, you have access to the male world. And as a woman, you have access to the kind of sisterhood female world. And it was very interesting to see what was happening there. What we did with Klingendahl, for example, was set up a training in mediation, because we noticed that in all the post-conflict mediation in the continent, there were hardly any women involved. So we thought, let's train the mediators. And with Klingendahl, we had quite an extensive program, and we trained really a lot of African female mediators. But unfortunately, they were still not hired. And so you can train what you want, but if they don't get hired, they're still not part of the solution. And so there is still really a problem there. But I thought, Vanessa, if you allow me, I thought let's also go maybe to our society, because it's so easy to talk about another society and have a look at it and see everything that's, could have been better. But if I look at our society, and I was really triggered by what Ambassador Vasi said when he was talking about a safe space. Because I think for many women and girls, there is a lot of violence and a lot of harassment in our space. If we talk about home, if we talk about the public space, or if we talk about work. And I think that's very important, because if there's not a safe space, it's very difficult for women to move around and also to have some kind of a career. And I was really triggered by a survey by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, which says that 53% of women avoid certain situations or places for fear of being physically or sexually assaulted. That is a lot. That is half of the women who are really scared. And then another number that they mentioned was that half of the women, 55% of the women in the EU, have experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. And even 75% of women in higher management positions are facing this kind of pushback. And I think it's very interesting if you read that review or that research, you see that especially in organizations where traditionally men are in the majority, or where women are taking positions traditionally assigned to men, this behavior is prevalent. So if you talk about women in security organizations, or very much also in the police, the army, you see this pushback. And I think the Me Too movement was also a wake-up call. And I think it's also interesting because we are now French-Dutch discussion. It would be interesting to hear a little bit on maybe from the French perspective. Maybe let's have a look at the clock. I think the pushback is something that we should be really aware of. I think also in populism, in this whole kind of nostalgia for the traditional values. And it's something that we really have to be careful for. And also, I think, and maybe also for Beatrice, I don't know if she has a view on that as well. I read the research as well that violence against women is a precursor of political violence in your society. So making sure that women are secure is also securing your society. And maybe it starts with derogatory talk, through the Proud Boys, you end up in violence. It's something that is, also in our societies, I think it's something that we really have to take care of. And then maybe just to conclude, if I can, what we can do, I think, and just let me all wish you a powerful Women's Day, as the South African sisters would say. I think we have to raise our girls to be strong women and to make sure that we reward them for being decisive and daring and entrepreneurial, for many, I think, traits that usually women are not rewarded for. Encourage them to study and to be ambitious. Make sure that they have this safe space that we were just talking about. And another point that we discussed earlier today with Dutch women was that I would also say, let's have quota. And let's see what the French women think about that. With the 4 Dutch women that we discussed at lunchtime, we ended up saying, yes, let's follow the Norwegian example. Because apparently it's a very good example. Within 4 or 5 years, they went from 6% women in corporate boards up to the 40% that was in their legislation without really a lot of trouble. And you know, if we share this planet, if we live here together, let's also run the planet together.
Thank you so much. Sorry to even ask if you wanted me to ask you a question. I just wasn't sure if you'd come prepared, but you'd come beautifully prepared. Now, again, a fantastic contribution. I really like your point about current pushback. That's really a worry that we see emerging in right-wing discourse, in particular at the moment, around the idea that women have a place outside of the public space. I also really liked your point about these safe spaces, which Ambassador Vasi mentioned, because ultimately it's really important that we all remember, and you indicated this when you talked about South Africa, you know, the difference between war and peace is not a dichotomy for women, it is a continuum. The violence that women experience during war and during peacetime, it doesn't end in peacetime, yeah? And I think that's often overlooked in a lot of the more official sort of discourse around, okay, well, we found a solution, we've mediated. And I'd be very interested to hear any of your views on sort of how we can, in particular, bring mediation forward, but also how we can actually not just have women participate. I mean, there you were saying, look, we've trained these women, and then no one would hire them. Going back to something I mentioned previously about the problem of saying, oh, we don't have enough qualified women because the job description is designed for men who have been in certain positions all their life. So we need to rethink that, right? But I also, something that struck me just sort of anecdotally from my research, not something I've actually done any much work on, is that even when, you know, you have so-called participatory peace processes, you know, the Colombian example was hailed as a success for women in many areas. I'm not sure that that actually continues beyond a certain point. So I'm just wondering as well, how often we sort of say, right, we've got a nice peace process and women were included, and then women's rights get shunted off to the side again, and the patriarchal sort of norms come back into play, which you talked about in particular in South Africa. And finally, I think your point as well about protection and participation, these cannot be disaggregated when we talk about women's involvement in security, right? Because you need a certain space in order to be able to function. So I really liked that you brought that out. And I think the point as well that's come through in everybody's conversations is, you know, women have traditionally not been included in discussions of security. And yet, as you've just said, Marisa, you know, women face insecurity on a daily basis. I defy any woman to not have looked over their shoulder on a dark night or not, well, I won't go there because that looks like a dodgy, you know. So we face insecurity on a level that men never do, and yet we're never asked about it. It's ridiculous, isn't it? I notice everyone's being very shy and there aren't a lot of questions. So I'm going to start and abuse my position by asking any of the panels if, I mean, Marisa, what she mentioned about quotas is obviously a very hot topic at the moment in the Netherlands. So perhaps we can have maybe the French perspective on that. I think, why not? Let's respond to that. Perhaps we could have the cameras of all the speakers up again, and including the ambassador, and then we can have a more of a discussion. As Marisa's here, if we can perhaps have the other cameras. Not me. Would anybody like to weigh in on the issue of quotas on behalf of France while we're waiting to see our respondents again, our speakers?
Would be happy to do it if maybe Louise wants.
No, I will.
Sorry, I couldn't see your hand.
I would just say I'm absolutely all for it. It obliges you and it drives. It's a driver to make sure that you actually go and make sure that you broaden the pool of resources and people that you're going to envisage for the top positions. So it's actually a powerful tool, and it's not an unfair tool, as I always said when I was actually involved in the promotions at the ministry. I have never seen any occasion where the incentive to meet the quota has created an unfair situation for male colleagues. So in a sense, I don't see the difficulty, frankly.
Nathalie, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I would be happy to do it because as Muriel, I was involved in an association called Women and Diplomacy, and we pushed for quotas in the diplomatic system in France, simply because if you don't like positive discrimination, you should not like the current situation where there are too many men in top positions, which means that you have no certainty that they are relevant, that they are competent. There is a risk that so many men include incompetent men who were hired just because they were men. So bringing women to the conversation brings more talent. It brings diversity, because I think that we are wonder women. We wonder, we question the status quo. We always have questions about how, why, what, because in a way we are newcomers, so we have fresh thinking. It's not that we are better than men, it's just that we are not accustomed to the rules and to the habits. And as long as we have the status of newcomers, it provides with fresh ideas. I am very much against professions where there are too many women as well, because they can be places of status quo and routine. And it sometimes happens among teaching communities, even if I know that top positions are more often for men than for women. It also happens in medical staff where you have a number of women, or it happens in the judiciary, at least in France. When you have an overwhelming majority of just one gender, you have a risk of people getting used to some habits and not questioning these habits. So the gender balance is important. And we know that it doesn't come naturally. I heard it time and again when I was a young diplomat. It was, don't worry, it will come naturally. And it did not. Among the women who entered the Foreign Office in France when I was young, it was half women, half men. And 20 years later, we were among 18% of the top tops. So when I was asking, where are the women I used to know? The word which was used was, oh, this is natural evaporation. Just because women were deterred from taking top positions for a number of biases or unconscious self-censorship and so on and so forth. So if you don't have quotas, you don't make it. If you have quotas, you discover the pool which was supposed not to exist, because you have to look at it.
Yes, Muriel.
Yeah, very much along from the French team, very much along Louise and Nathalie's positions, and to add to their previous points, I would argue that along their lines, that what we need is one from women also to face. Be able to face the notion that, yes, I was, appointed in that position also because I'm a woman, and that's okay. That women should not be afraid of being women, because they should be self-confident. They should argue to themselves that there's no reason why there shouldn't be women, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be competent. So the notion that I have heard from many colleagues, men and women, that of course you wouldn't like to be there as the token women, quote unquote. Well, I would say no token women, but trust me, I will prove competent. And if I have been appointed because I'm a woman, in any case, I will prove I'm competent also as a woman, and that's okay. And I will inspire confidence also to other younger women, and that's also a sisterhood, principle that I think we should apply to ourselves. And then along and convincing other women that it's okay to be appointed also because you're a woman. So quotas are okay in this respect. And then echoing also Luis's points, I think we need to make it with men. I'm not saying this because, again, because I think it's right that men should be on board. A lot of us have lived with them. A lot of us, so I mean, we love men. I love men. We need men, and very much like Nathalie, I don't think women perspectives only is a good thing. So we need men on board, and we need men to realize they need us, also as in terms of work-life balance and all that. So the notion that men would support quotas and not see them as sort of a quote unquote emasculation is, I think, good. We need men to not behave like they're endangered species. We need them to support quotas for themselves, for a better outcome. And if they're not convinced, for their sisters, wives, and daughters. So I'm a strong advocate of both sisterhood that convinces younger women that it's okay to be appointed as a woman, and also sisterhood, brotherhood with men that we definitely need on board.
Thank you very much for your views. Well, it seems everyone's in agreement. But I'm going to draw Beatrice into the conversation to ask her a question specifically that I know is relevant in terrorism right now, but also I'd be interested from a historical perspective. I mean, people starting to talk about masculinities now and bringing masculinities into the conversation and different types of masculinities, sort of less an essentialist perspective on women and more on sort of, okay, are there different types of masculinities, and do they also suffer from hegemonic masculinity or toxic masculinity, as it's often called? So I just wondered, historically, do you think masculinities have changed over time? Do you think we're at a point where we're at the height or are lowering? What's your view on that from a historical perspective?
Thank you so much for that interesting question, Vanessa. I'm going to answer that question and also take into account Marissa's question about violence against women or gendered violence and the relation to political violence. First, your question, Vanessa, on masculinity. It's certainly the case that the way society is structured around frames and narratives of gender have changed over time. Masculinity was so much an issue of honor, of standing guard for your community in the early 19th century with the duels that were being fought. And I just referred to the book Man on Horseback by David Bell. And that's very much a sort of a spectrum of male, masculine values that were cherished, that were put out. There's a great book about this, how these values, these masculine narratives were translated into the current time by George Lakoff. It's called Moral Politics, because politics also pivot around moral scripts about masculine, feminine behaviors. And George Lakoff, for example, has argued that one of the moral political frames is the frame of the strong father. So it's not so much the honor per se, but it's the fatherly care for his community that makes a leader strong, that makes all women and subaltern men subscribe to his leadership. This also explains, for example, it can be one-on-one projected on the Trump era. It explains why so many females elected Trump in power because he was the strong father who protected his family against outside enemies. And as long as you felt part or wanted to feel part of his family, you were protected by him. And the other, so to say, opposition to that is the nurturing parent model, as it was harbored by Hillary Clinton or also by Obama. It's the model where you don't have these hierarchical relationships, but far more horizontal, relational talks as in a nurturing parentship, where it's not just the man or the women or the mother or the father, but you're doing it both. And this is also a very strong motive in politics. And it is for sure that today's populism is very much structured around this moral, this masculine model of the fatherly caring father that, the fatherly caring leader that takes care of his people. About masculinity as such, and this brings me to the question that Marissa very rightfully posed. Is it about identity? Is it about gender frames? Or is it about structural inequality? This is a debate going on in the literature. Is this whole talk about identity politics, wokeism or not, social justice warriors, is it not distracting from, as you could say, positivist, real objective empirical inequalities between men and women? And I'm very much caught between the two debates, because there's so much to morals and norms and identity and patterns and constructivism in politics. There is, because it's very much also engendered by the social media. But underneath, there's also always these inequalities. And there's a great book that came out. It's called The Political Economy of Violence Against Women. And this book states very clearly that there is no place in the world where women share exactly the equal social and economic rights that men do. No place in the world where that is the case. Still, some places women fare better, have more rights, are more safe than in other places. And these places correlate with the level of economic independence, of gender equality, and of equality as such between classes and categories in society. And places where there's deep social and economic inequalities are also the places where women most vulnerable to violence and abuse, in whatever context. It can be left-wing populist context, right-wing populist context, dictatorial situations. The social and economic inequalities are deep. There, women will be always vulnerable for abuse and violence. So it's not just the case that political violence and genders violence against women or violence against women is a kind of precursor to political violence. There's even a layer deeper, that if there is deep inequalities in society, it plays out against the most vulnerable in society, not just women, also children, girls, or also minorities in society. So it's not just about identity and about culture, it's also always very much about political economy. And I think that's also important to bring into this discussion tonight. I hope that answered your question a little bit, Marissa.
It certainly answered mine. I mean, I just was like making frantic notes. Got to look up that person. Got to read that book.
Jackie True. Her surname is True.
Oh, Jackie True. Yes.
Yes.
I'm very familiar with her work. I knew the name of the book, but the moral politics one as well, I've got to now read. George Laker.
Yes, he's brilliant.
It's always a joy when someone's so well read and they throw out all these and you think, right, this is all on my reading list. I think we're out of time, but what an amazing discussion and such a rich wealth of experience from you all. I wish we were live and we could be sitting having a cup of coffee or perhaps something stronger and picking your brains about all the other things that you've got to talk about. So again, I just want to make very brief closing remarks to thank you all for your insights. Nathalie Loiseau, Beatrice de Graaf, Marielle Domenard, Marissa Gerard, and of course, thank you so much for hosting this, Ambassador Louis Vassy. Thank you so much. I think everyone's now got a really good taste of the kind of expertise that we see in our international institutions and some of our educational institutions here in the Netherlands. So, I mean, we just need more of people like you. That's my final comment.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you soon in real life. And Muriel and Marissa, you're more than welcome in The Hague.
Thank you so much. It was far too short. Thank you, Vanessa and Louise and Marisa and everyone else.
Thank you, everyone. It was a real pleasure.
Bye-bye. Au revoir.
Au revoir.